Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Not for Glory, a historical novel of Scotland, by J.R. Tomlin, narrated by Gary Furlong. For as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is not for glory, nor riches, nor honour that we are fighting, but for freedom. For that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. The Declaration of Arbroath, 1320. June 24th, 1314, Bannockburn, Scotland. The English host was trapped against the waters of the Bannockburn. The bristling hedge of Scottish steel shoved once more into the desperate knights, and Sir James de Douglas eyed the banners flying above the writhing mass. Those included the massive scarlet banner with the Plantagenet leopards that proclaimed that King Edward of Carnarvon was somewhere in the chaos. James bellowed, "A Douglas! A Douglas!" Battle fury swept through him, rage and hatred unleashed for the losses and the pain. He thrust his sword into an English neck. For his father, for Isabella, for Thomas, for Ailsie, for all of the dead. With every opening in their skiltron, it was the same. Slam with his shield, slash with his sword, and when his man went down, a stab to the throat. And then on to the next as blood ran down his sword to dye his gauntlets scarlet. Around him his men screamed, "Scotland! Scotland! On them!" Hungry for revenge, they had spent their lives fighting the invader, and had become savagely good at war. Their feet slipped in the blood-slicked grass. They stepped over bodies as their skiltron pressed forward. An arrow sliced in from the right, striking James's shield. He lifted it, but no more arrows came. Archers would have been the last chance for the English, but King Robert de Bruce had planned well for them, holding back his 500 Scottish chivalry to sweep behind the line and attack the archers. James's men bellowed as they hacked their pikes into the bellies and faces of English horses, into the gaps in gleaming armour, and chopped with their weapons. The English fell back, horses screaming as they went down the steep edge of a gully. The enemy had nowhere to go. Under the hooves of English knights men lay dead, wounded, shrieking in pain. Their commanders yelled orders to retire, while James slashed each man who came before him. The English shouted curses, thrust with lances, and swung swords as they were forced back. Ribbons of scarlet rippled through the Bannockburn's waters. They fought with the desperation of trapped men. Next to James, one of his men shouted as he chopped his pike. Another horse went down. Blood and mud splattered. The rider threw himself free, landing flat on his back. James slammed a foot on the knight's chest and thrust his sword through the man's throat. "Forward!" he roared. "They fail!" "Sir James!" James spun at a hand at his shoulder and jerked his sword arm into position. A wide-eyed squire dodged backward, stumbling on the broken earth. "The king sent me. He wants you." An unhorsed Englishman screamed as a slashing hoof crushed his head. He fell atop a knight, already dead. James's own men wore helms and studded leather marked with the blue and white saltire of Scotland, now streaked with mud and blood and gore. The steel tide surged against the crumbling mass of a panicked foe. Another step forward. For 6 hours they'd fought since the cool of dawn, hacking at an army that seemed without number. His arm suddenly was heavy with the fatigue from a day of slash and thrust. The English trumpets shrilled thinly. "Hurroo! Hurroo! Retire! Retire!" He blinked, the sting of sweat from his eyes. Where was Walter Stewart? In the chaos, James spotted Walter's blue and white checky pennant. He grabbed Ian's arm and pulled him out of the line of pikemen. "Find Sir Walter. Tell him he has sole command of our men." He shoved his sword into his black leather sheath and jerked a nod to the squire. "Lead on." The lad led James across the broken sod, past a sprawled knight, his armour still agleam as his blood soaked into the dry earth. They passed thousands of shrieking men screaming, "Scotland!" as they hacked at the English. For a moment a wind from the east gusted the smell of the salt sea and cut through the fog of blood and shit. Who would have imagined such a battle? A body clad in a studded brigandine marked with a saltire lay pierced by the shattered remains of a pike next to a gutted stallion. A crow, its black feathers gleaming in the sun, took flight from the guts spilled onto the ground with an angry craw. They trudged past it all, and the uproar faded behind them into a rumble. Beyond a stand of alder, leaves drooping in summer's heat, the king's scarlet lion banner hung limp in the still air. The lad pointed. James slapped his shoulder and strode through the welcome shade of the trees while reaching up to wrench off his helm. Robert de Bruce's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his head tilted as he listened to what the Keith was saying. At the Bruce's feet sat a helm topped by a gold crown. Enemy blood streaked his armour and cloth of gold tabard. He ran a hand through fair hair dripping with sweat. "Jamie," the king exclaimed. James worked spit into his parched mouth. "Your Grace." "Bring him water," the Bruce said, and the squire scurried away. The Keith said, "King Edward fled the field." James felt his eyes widen as he looked from his good father to the king. "Come." The Bruce strode through the alders so they could watch the battle. On a distant hill, Stirling Castle loomed grey against a cloudless noon sky. The king shook his head. "If someone took command, they might still win the day. They're in full flight." The Keith pointed toward the battle and passed to the deep gully cut by the Bannockburn. "They're forcing their horses down the slope into the burn. Already it's mired with bodies. Some are fleeing for the river Forth. Our men are so weary, they can barely lift a pike," the king said, squinting at the roiling mass of the battle. "How many hours can a man fight? If the battle turned now, we'd be in a desperate case." The squire ran up with a cup and flagon, and thrust the cup of water into James's hand. He gulped the drink, and it ran down his throat like rain after a drought. He held the cup out and let the squire refill it. "But without their king?" His voice was clearer now. "I want to pursue Edward," the Keith said. He slid a glance toward the king. "No one is left to rally them. Aymer de Valence fled with Edward. They say young Gloucester died in the first charge." "We don't know where Robert de Clifford is, or Humphrey de Bohun, or Ralph de Monthermer. And Gloucester, I pray God you're wrong for the sake of his family. But even broken, such a vast army is dangerous, like a wounded boar." His gaze was fixed on the chaos of the battle. The sound was a roar of a distant sea. Remorseless. "I won't chance it." "Did King Edward make for Stirling Castle?" James asked. The Keith jerked a nod. "I pursued him so far. Mowbray must have refused him entrance. They turned south." "No, Lord Marshal. I'll have 60 of your chivalry. That will leave you a full 400 if we have need of them." The Bruce skewered James with a look. "You'll lead the 60 to follow the cursed English king." James blew out a long breath. His whole body was a mass of weary aches. He looked at the cup in his hand, lifted it, and dumped the water over his head. It ran through his hair and down his cheeks to drip from his close-cropped beard, mixing with sweat until he shook his head hard like a wet hound. The king and his good father were watching him. "We'll skirt the battle and take the North Park road." James scraped his wet hair back with a hand as he pictured the way. "We can ford the Bannockburn to the east where its banks are lower." "Sir Robert's horse, and one for Sir James," the Bruce said, with a thrust of his chin at the waiting squire. The lad gave a quick bow and ran. "How many ride with him?" James asked. 500. His good father narrowed his eyes. "Mayhap more." "I can't take them with 60 knights." "I know that," the king said. "Harry them. Capture any who fall behind. See them out of Scotland." "It's too bad to let them escape," the Keith said. "Do you think I don't know that, man?" The king glared at the Keith. "Even now, with your men, could you defeat them if I dared give leave? They number more than our chivalry, are better mounted, experienced knights all, and I dare not lose my only mounted men." "I could defeat them!" The Bruce put a hand on the Keith's shoulder. "You saved our lives for us, breaking the English archers with your charge. If you hadn't, it is we who would have died this day. But this you cannot do." The Keith bowed his defeat, though his tight face showed how reluctant he was. James turned at the rattle of harness and took the reins of a horse from the lad. He blinked, trying to remember which squire this was, and shrugged the thought away. The king laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you do, do not try to fight them, Jamie." He bowed and swung into the saddle. "Let's find me my men, my lord." He twitched a smile that felt more like a grimace. His good father mounted, his face knotted in a frown. James shook his head at him. He couldn't argue with the king's stand. Even fleeing the guards around King Edward and Aymer de Valence would fight to the last man. Outnumbered, upon lesser mounts, he doubted the Keith's knights could defeat the English king's guard, however determined the Keith might be. Behind them the king was shouting commands. Hours of fighting remained, albeit that wasn't James's problem now. Sir Robert de Keith set his horse to a canter, and James followed. To the left flank of the battle, Scottish knights stood beside their mounts, tending their light coursers, pissing, scratching, talking and laughing, though the laughter had a weary sound to it. James grunted. "My banner is still with my men. I'd not care to be taken for a Sassenach on the road." "Best have one of the men retrieve it." He pulled up and gave his troop a frowning survey before he called out to young Lockhart, knighted only the day before. "Sir Simon, you and your men are to follow Sir James." The knight, his sweaty red hair still smashed to his head from a helm that rested at his feet, blinked up at James. Sir Simon picked up the helm, donned it, and swung into his saddle. "Mount up!" Lockhart sent one of his men to retrieve James's battle banner. The talk died as they mounted, muttering and giving James long looks. These weren't his own men, and they knew him only by reputation. James stood in his stirrups and shouted, "The English king ran like the craven dog that he is. We are to see he keeps running." He paused before he went on. "We'll not stop even to take a piss, not until the damned English thieves are out of our lands." He wheeled his horse and gave the command to move out. He sent a dozen men to spread out ahead and scout as they headed towards Stirling Castle to find the English king's fleeing party. The victory should have had the men in good spirits, but a day of bloody battle and a ride with too few in their party, should they face a real fight, had their faces sombre. James felt their unease at his back. As he rode, James peeled off his gloves to flex his hands and worked his shoulders. If he let himself stiffen, it would go ill in a fight. A man could never relax. James led them wide around the battle, but the sound of screams and the blare of horns followed them. Sir Simon spurred his horse to catch up as they wended their way past the thick stand of oaks, and down the low slope to the river Forth, a gleaming grey ribbon. The fresh sea air of the Firth blew in his face as he turned toward the ford. "Will we find them, you think?" Sir Simon asked. "Aye, we will." They rode in silence except for the clatter of harness and armour, until Sir Simon said, "When we do." James shrugged. How could he know what would happen? He would follow the Bruce's command, albeit the chase still might come to a fight. Before he voiced the thought, one of the scouts galloped down the far slope and into the river, water spraying. "Riders ahead, my lord! Coming this way!" the man shouted. James pulled up his mount with a jerk and the animal danced under him. "How many? What banner?" "Fourscore. Fresh. They've seen no fighting. Under a pennant with a red lion. They rode out of the Torwood." Wheeling in a tight turn, James yelled, "Close order!" Many pennants had a lion device. A pennant meant it wasn't one of the great lords, though, especially not with such a small number in his tail. He tightened his hand on the hilt of his sword as he kicked his horse to a canter, splashed through the low water of the ford, and gave the horse a smack on the flank. Its haunches bunched as it laboured to keep a fast pace up the slope. This would be a ruinous spot to be caught. He spurred it, and it heaved to the top of the rise. He pulled up and narrowed his eyes in the glare of a bright summer sun. A band of armoured riders, 80 strong. The yellow pennant wasn't one he knew, but from the shout and the sudden halt of the armed party, he suspected they knew his. He snorted and glanced up at his banner. The night before, Robert de Bruce had cut the tails from his pennant and raised them to a knight banneret. His heart had pounded at the honour, but the stars on a blue chief had not changed. He smiled as he pulled his sword from its sheath. "Will they fight?" his young companion asked. "We'll soon know." James nudged his horse a couple of paces ahead to yell, "Who goes there? Who asks?" came the answer from a knight in unsoiled armour, yellow tabard bright in the afternoon sun. James raised his blade. "Swords to the ready!" Sir Simon shifted his shield onto his arm as he urged his horse a pace forward and to James's right. He heard the sound of hooves and clatter of weapons as his men formed up on him to attack. "Wait!" The knight rode 6 paces toward them. "The Black Douglas?" "Your name and your title?" "Sir Lawrence Abernathy of Saltoun." The man kneed his dune another step forward. "You fought the English? There's been a battle? You want to join them? They are dying on the banks of the Bannockburn. It runs red with their blood, and I pursue their king." "They're defeated?" The man gaped, open-mouthed. "Truly? Do I look like I jape?" James knew how he looked, blood and dirt-streaked as he was. Abernathy was shaking his head. He slowly raised his sword arm, hand empty. "No. King Robert. He'll take me into his peace. I've heard he does those who return and swear to him. I'll aid you in pursuing King Edward." James snorted. Of course the Bruce would take the man's oath. Another traitor taken into the king's peace, but hell mend him if he liked having Abernathy at his back. That Randolph had proved true, and his good father as well, didn't mean he would trust the rest of the pack of traitorous dogs. Yet the English king had almost 10 times his number, and he needed these men. James leaned to Hawk and spit. He'd take the devil as an ally against the invader, and swallow the foul taste of it. Straightening, he eyed the man, and gave a silent sigh. "Your word, then. You'll swear to King Robert when we return to his camp. Until then, you aid me." "My word as a knight. I swear it." James laid his sword across his saddle-bow. The thought of turning his back on traitors always made the skin between his shoulder blades itch. "Then welcome home, Sir Lawrence." James's mouth twisted in a grim smile. Behind him the men were muttering, and he heard a curse. "What happened?" Sir Lawrence asked as James and Simon nudged their horses to a canter. He motioned his men to join theirs. "We won, and the damned English lost." He had no reason not to tell the man more, however much he loathed returning traitors. "We trapped them in a bend at the Bannockburn, and our pikes tore them to bloody shreds." The ash and oak giants of the Torwood spread before them, the old Roman road wending its way through. James led them into its shadows. The shade of the green canopy cooled them from the heat of summer sun and battle, and James pushed them to keep a fast pace. At a shallow burn, where sunlight broke through the leaves to dapple silver, splashing waves, James stopped to water the horses. They had no time for rest. The scouts returned with no news. He sent them again to search the road near Linlithgow. "Won't they make for Berwick?" Simon asked, as they rode beneath the towering trees. In the dappled shade, James scanned the dusty road. "Castle Dunbar is nearer. The towers there have passage down the cliff to the sea where galleys are kept." James nudged his horse ahead, too weary for idle chatter. They rode in silence, the thud of hooves accompanied by a whisper of the breeze through the leaves. The sun was half dropped behind rolling hills when they emerged from the forest, a mosaic of purple and green and the yellow of gorse flowers stretching before them. James spotted 3 of their scouts atop the nearest low swell, waving their arms over their heads. He spurred his horse to meet them. "We found them. They halted to rest." A bald scout, thin as a pike, beamed as he pointed to the south. "Just past the next hill." Overhead a hawk flew in slow circles. "Swords to the ready!" James shouted. They had no time to waste. His sword sang as he took a practice swing. He wheeled his horse and spurred it to a gallop. It stretched its legs into a ground-eating stride, hoof-beats rattling like hail. They topped the low hill. A bow shot away, knights held the reins of their horses, squatting and talking, and a few were mounting to ride. Hundreds of knights in battered armour and tabards still bright beneath streaks of dried blood. A tall man with a crown atop his gilded helm sat a dappled grey charger. Next to him a standard-bearer mounted a dun. Above them streamed the scarlet Plantagenet leopard banner. "Wedge!" James shouted. They formed the flying arrowhead with him at its point. Sir Simon took the place on his right. On his left rode Sir Lawrence, sword in hand. He heard horses thudding behind him. "A Douglas! A Douglas!" he shouted. English knights scrambled onto their lathered mounts. Voices bellowed, "To horse! To the king!" Horses reared and plunged as riders jumped into the saddle. One jerked its reins free. Its knight ran after it a few steps, threw down his shield and dropped to his knees as it departed in an unfeeling gallop. The fleeing men streamed around the kneeling knight like a gleaming river surging past a rock. They flogged their horses as they coursed after the king. James cursed and jerked on the reins, pulling his mount to a rearing halt. Simon was off his horse, sword at the throat of the kneeling Englishman. The man dropped his sword, shoulders sagging. "I yield!" James gritted his teeth. He couldn't disobey the Bruce's command further than he had, but letting them escape made his face hot with fury. "Simon, chase down yon mount and bring your prisoner. He'll have to catch up to us." At least he would make the English flight to Dunbar a dangerous and miserable one. They rode through the warm summer twilight that never fully darkened. Once, when the English stopped to water their horses, James swooped in on them, screaming his battle cry, but let them gallop away. One of the Lacys who'd stood facing a tree taking a long piss moved too slowly, and yielded to James's sword at his back. Hands bound, he joined Simon's prisoner, horses led by one of their men. The rutted road turned and twisted through the hills in the purple night. During the long ride, every muscle clenched and cramped from James's neck to his toes. He wanted to rub his thighs where the muscles burned, but they were encased in mail. Summer nights were short, but this one seemed never to end. They'd fallen behind, so he kneed his horse to a lope. Shortly he heard ahead the thud of hooves and clatter of armour and weapons. A breeze sighed, carrying a scent of the sea. James breathed it deep. At last, pewter fingers stretched above the eastern horizon to outline Dunbar Castle, high atop a cliff. Gulls squalled as they plunged to the water. Shouts too far to make out came from the walls and the sound of horns in challenge. A drawbridge crashed down. "Merciful St. Bridge, we've done what we were sent for." He slid from the horse and grabbed his saddlebow when his legs wobbled, needles of pain flashing through cramped muscles. He listened to shouts of welcome as the English king went beyond his reach within high, thick stone walls. Metal squealed on metal as chains lowered the portcullis of Dunbar Castle. "They might ride yet for Berwick," Simon said. "Mayhap we could take more prisoners." James stretched his back and a joint popped. He grimly contemplated climbing into the saddle and decided to walk for a few minutes. He turned to go the way they had come. They will escape by sea. At least Edward of Carnarvon will. I must return to the king. James spied Cambuskenneth Abbey, a mass of grey granite topped by an enormous square bell tower, where the bells tolled sweetly and unceasing. Bells clanged from every steeple in Stirling town in the distance. On and on they cried out, a Korean for Scotland's great victory. He let out a gust of a sigh as he reined up at the carved wooden doors 12 feet high, and climbed from the saddle. They'd snatched 2 hours' rest near Dunbar before riding for Stirling. Between the battle and the pursuit, James had lost count of the hour since any of them had slept or eaten a meal. Simon had swayed in the saddle for the last hour, and the men slumped like sacks of grain. He lifted his helm to tuck under his arm. "Simon, see to the men. Find where the prisoners are held and where we are to lodge. Rest and eat. I'll see to Sir Lawrence." He nodded toward the spread of grey stone buildings. "If you need aught, find me." He waited as the prisoners were pulled from the saddle and turned to a guard, shifting his feet as he leaned on a pike. "The king?" James asked. "In the refectory, my lord. It's been a fair to-do since the battle," the man said as he opened the door. James strode into the cool dimness of an arched entry toward voices in a far room. The warm air, heavy with the scent of incense, pressed like a blanket. Holy St. Bridge, but he was weary. Through the doorway was a vaulted refectory. Walls whitewashed and lined with polished oaken tables stacked with gold and silver plate. Gleaming jewellery piled high. Weapons, helmets, and painted shields. Stacks of bright tapestries. Fine worked harness. And 2 tables heaped with golden spurs by the 100. The room hummed with the scratch of quills upon parchment, and the voices of clerics murmuring as they counted the English treasure. Robert de Bruce sat in the carved abbot's chair. James's breath went out of him at the sight of the king. They had won. The king lived. Until this moment he hadn't believed the truth of it. James had thought they would lose, that at the end of the day they would die. The shadows under the king's eyes looked bruised, and his face was drawn with fatigue, but his armour was polished and his cloth of gold tabard clean of the blood and filth of battle. "Your Grace!" James strode past Abbot Bernard, bent over a parchment to oversee the clerics counting the captured loot. A squire scurried in with a silver flagon. "I couldn't take him. The English king reached Dunbar and took refuge there, sire." He dropped to a knee in front of the king, and a laugh welled up in his chest. "But we won!" The king dropped a hand on his shoulder and squeezed hard. "Aye, Jamie. We won." They shared a long, smiling look. "Now tell me how you did with the pursuit." James rose to his feet. "We harried them, and took Sir Anthony de Lacy a prisoner. We accomplished little else, I fear. Aymer de Valence was not with them. I saw no sign of him or his banner. On the way," he muffled a snort, "I was aided by Sir Lawrence Abernathy. He'd approach you if he might." The Bruce narrowed his eyes at James's companion, hanging a few steps back. "Sir Lawrence, you aided my good Sir James. Yet you've been in England with my enemies." "Your Grace," Sir Lawrence dropped to a knee. "I was with the English, but—" The man quailed under the Bruce's frown. "I beg you to accept me into your peace, sire. I'll serve you well. I swear it." Bruce turned his head at a footstep from a side door. A tall man, threads of grey in his dark hair and dressed in a tunic of blue and gold samite, stepped through the doorway and bowed to the king. The Bruce gazed down at the supplicant. "So be it. I accept your oath." The king gave Sir Lawrence his hand to kiss. "And I take you into my peace." Sir Lawrence rose as the Bruce waved him away. Sir Lawrence looked happy to make for the door. James placed his helm on the table beside a bowl of summer berries and rubbed the back of his neck. "How many did we lose?" "Few knights. One of the Ross lads, young William. Of wounded we have many, mostly from pikes that shattered under the weight of war horses. Gilbert de la Haye will bring a report, and we'll know more when my brother and Thomas return." The stranger said in a choked voice, "Nothing compared to our losses. James, here is an old friend, Sir Ralph de Monthermer." The king's mouth thinned as he shook his head. "His stepson, The Earl of Gloucester lies in the chapel." Gilbert de Clare killed? James realized his mouth was open and snapped it closed. One of the greatest names in England, the nephew of King Edward of Carnarvon.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?